Hello, and welcome to the Space for Kentucky Roundtable. The Space for Kentucky Roundtable is a series of meetings focused on growing the space industry. It is about networking, education, and social support for those who are reaching for the stars. The last four have centered around spaceports. If you would like to sign up to get notifications for upcoming meetings, they happen about every other month or so, depending upon what's going on. You know, we have lots of different guests. Spaceports bring innovation, education, and inspiration to an area while providing economic growth. So that is kind of my take on the whole spaceport thing. It doesn't necessarily mean you're launching rockets, but it means that you're a hub for space. Space begins at spaceports. You can't launch a rocket, you can't get anything to space without a spaceport. So the infrastructure. Now, one of the things that is a concern for me is that in the next 10 to 20 years, space is going to come on in a very big way. We have a lot of different industries that are on the cutting edge of their industry, and things are getting ready to tip in a lot of different ways. This is a picture of the Gallatin County Regional Airport cutting last June, and it took almost 20 years for the first shovel of dirt to be done. It takes a long time to get spaceports, airports, any of those things, big initiatives gone through. We have to start now. This particular picture right here is of Houston Spaceport. Now, Houston Spaceport, they have been around since the early teens, and they are working at lightning speed. They right now have taken $21 million of airport infrastructure money. And as of last time I talked to them at the Spaceport Summit, they had $6 billion in contracts. And these are companies like Axiom Space. They're building the module that's going to be replacing the International Space Station. And they are also doing Intuitive Machines, which just landed on the moon in February. And they have Collins Aerospace there, which is creating spacesuits. And they also have Venus Aerospace, which is creating supersonic, hypersonic, and space planes that will be able to ride the atmosphere and create a point-to-point. One of the things that is going to be a tipping point is the ability to manufacture in space, because there's a lot of things you can make in space you cannot make down here, and bring them back safely and economically. And so once these planes start really getting their wings under them, it's going to make the space industry explode. If you go back to the Space for Kentucky website, you can see the recordings for part one. Houston Spaceport did talk about that, as well as all the different things that a spaceport can bring to a community. And then with part two, we had Sierra Space, which is also working on a space plane. This panel talked about the different aircraft that can use a horizontal launch situation. Kentucky has got more population. It cannot have a vertical launch situation right now. So who knows in the next 20 years if we'll be able to do something different. But right now, that's what the situation is. So these are people that were talking about their technology that can use a horizontal launch facility. And then the last one that we had talked about alternative fuels. And this was very interesting because some of, like Via Space, is taking plastic bottles and making them into rocket fuel. The Skywara is also using components that are green. The UK is looking at having a zero carbon footprint with their reach for space. They have 7 spaceports in the works. And I want you to think that they're just a little bigger than Kentucky, and they have 7. UK is taking off into space in a big way. And today we're going to be talking about how to get it started, because nothing happens without proving that you can make money with it. And so we have to do an economic impact study to be able to begin any of these particular initiatives. These are our guests tonight. We have Dr. Mick O'Connor from Scotland, and he is the co-founder and managing director at Fire Arrow, which helps spaceports actually get established and walks them through the process. We have Stuart Ditto, which is the former executive director during the Kentucky Aerospace Industry Consortium, and he actually took Kentucky through their impact study for aerospace. And then we have Paul Sloan from Paso Robles, and he is right smack dab in the middle of an economic impact study for his spaceport in California. Without further ado, Dr. Mick O'Connor is the co-founder and managing director of Fire Arrow, which is a spaceflight company that enables governments and commercial organizations to achieve safe, sustainable, responsive, and affordable access to space. He is a chartered engineer and a chartered director, a fellow of the Institute of Directors, a fellow of the Institution of Engineers in Scotland, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And he has 40 years experience working in space, aerospace, defense, aviation, shipbuilding, oil, petrochemical, utilities, and consulting. And he is the founder of Halo and is developing a configurable twin technology, which is one of those industries that is coming on in a big way is digital twinning. And that combines AI and human situation awareness to detect and respond to emergent threats, which we also have that on the way as well. So there's some threats going on as well. He was program director at the Prestwick Spaceport and general manager of the MOD Live Missile Test Ranges across the UK, and is currently a Royal Academy of Engineering visiting professor at Glasgow Collodion, I'm sorry, I mangled that one, University, and a collector of the Incorporation of Hammermen of Glasgow. So please welcome Dr. Mick O'Connor.
Firstly, greetings from Bonnie, Scotland. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. In my case, it's 10 past 11 in the evening. What I would like to do is talk about two different aspects of, let's say, economic development. One at a national level and the other at a spaceport level. But again, when I start to get into it, hopefully it will become clear. And I think that in terms of having these kind of events, I think the important thing as a community is that we work together and we collaborate and we share learning and share ideas. And I think in terms of the furtherance of the global space industry, and particularly spaceports, I think the more we do that, I think the better it will be for all of us. So what I'll do is firstly introduce me and Izzy. I think you've pretty much already done that, but that's okay. I will then introduce Fire Arrow and what Fire Arrow is all about and some of the background to it. We'll then talk about Scotland as a thriving new space nation, and Izzy touched on where we are in the UK. But it's quite acute in Scotland in terms of the progress that we've made in the last decade. And then finally, we'll talk about the economic case for a spaceport in terms of the component parts, certainly in my experience, to get to a point where you can actually get to the build stage. And as you said, is then put a shovel in the ground. So as Izzy had already stated, so I'm Mick O'Connor. I'm a chartered engineer. I won't go through all this again. Chartered engineer, I'm chartered director. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Directors, Royal Academy of Engineering, visiting professor. I'm also supporting the UK government, and I'm a member of the Spaceflight Safety and Regulatory Council. So we oversee the UK space industry regulation. I was programme director at Prestwick Spaceport, co-founder of Fire Arrow, and I'll talk a bit more about Fire Arrow and what we do. And at Halo is the name of the company. So what we do is bring together satellite data, system data, sensor data, and human situational awareness to create some means of threat intelligence, focused primarily on governance, risk and compliance within financial services at the moment. However, we're looking at other heavily regulated verticals. I've worked for a range of different companies, some large and small in various industries. So I've been involved in oil rig construction, petrochemical and oil refinery turnarounds. I was involved in warship building, testing live missile systems, aircraft, helicopters and aircraft fixed wing MRO, involved in utilities and renewables, now in the space industry, and developing software. So a bit of an eclectic career, but very much engineering is the golden thread that runs through my career from beginning until now. So in terms of what we do as Fire Arrow and the background to Fire Arrow, that we've been involved in building a couple of spaceports in Scotland now for about five years. And I think, as I said, we didn't necessarily have a playbook to start with. So we've worked our way through it. We've used, good engineering principles. We've used common sense, but on the way, there was lots of unknowns that we then encountered that we then had to deal with. And what we felt with the combined experience and knowledge that we'd gained, that there was other nations out there at the start of that journey, and we felt that we could help them. So we started with a concept, and we thought, well, this is what the business model would look like. We tested that against the Global Spaceport Alliance and said, look, does this make sense? And is anybody else out there doing it? And they says, well, as far as they're aware, there's nobody else in the world doing what we're doing. They're doing bits of it, and they do bits of it very well. But in terms of joining the whole thing as a coherent whole, there's nobody else doing what we're doing. So we're looking to take advantage of that. So we enable governments and commercial organisations to achieve safe, responsive, sustainable and affordable access to space. At the moment, we are in negotiations with Malaysia. That's got big space aspirations. There's more to come on that in the future. We talked to Japan last week. We're also talking to Oman, and we're talking to Kenya. And more recently, we're talking to the Azores as well. So we'll see where that goes. And we do this from the ideation stage until the orbital insertion stage. And we do everything in between. But I'll touch on this in a bit more detail later on in the talk. So in terms of our pedigree, and this could be interesting for Kentucky. So I was program director at Prestwick Spaceport, and together with the technical director at Fire Arrow, Stuart Fivey, Stuart was program manager. So him and I had worked together for 5 years on this spaceport. What you see in the background is an integrated launch vehicle integration facility, satellite encapsulation and payload processing facility. And in the foreground here, what you see is an unmodified C-17. So unlike Virgin and Virgin's horizontal solution, where you had a modified and recertified 747, where the launch vehicle was strapped underneath the wing, then you've got to own the asset, you've got to maintain the currency of the aircrew, you've got to hangar it, you've got to do MRO. What this works on, this is working with a company called Astraeus, and their novel concept is to use an unmodified C-17 on a wet lease. So that comes with an aircrew with currency. So it comes on stand. It takes about 6 hours to integrate a comms console that then talks to the aircrew and talks to the launch vehicle. And at the end of that mission, then they fly back to their base, wherever their base happens to be. And there's a proliferation of about 260 of those airframes globally, which means if the aircraft went unserviceable, potentially could have another aircraft on stand, let's say, within a day. So they're getting quite a lot of interest in terms of their model. They're looking at launching a payload of about 800 kilograms, potentially going up to a metric ton, into high inclination orbits and sun synchronous orbits. The nature of their model means that we can go from Scotland and launch equatorially, because we can do air-to-air refueling as well. But at the moment, they're not focused on equatorial launch. It's purely polar orbits. This is Sutherland Spaceports. That's a vertical launch spaceport. So Stuart, the technical director, is currently working alongside Orbex at the moment. He's been working that project for some years. They're looking to launch payloads up to about 200 kilograms, again, into high inclination orbits and sun synchronous orbits. And finally, as I mentioned, I used to be the general manager of the Ministry of Defence live missile test ranges across the UK. What you're looking at here was an exercise that we conducted with the US DoD and the MDA, and that was called Formidable Shield, and that was conducted in 2017. So as much as we haven't undertaken an orbital launch from Scotland, we have put an object 320 kilometres into space, at about a tonne in weight. So it's the highest and largest and heaviest object that we've put into space. So we've already done it. So what we've got in Fire Arrow is experience of the design and development and build of both horizontal and vertical spaceports, and also the conduct and prosecution of launch missions. And we felt that positions us quite neatly in terms of the new space environment. So in terms of what we do as Fire Arrow, so we're a consortium of 16 companies. Some of them are small, boutique, but best-in-class consultancy companies. And then at the other end, we've got large multinational companies that want to be part of the journey. So at one end, we'll do environmental impact assessments. We'll look at human factors and the psychology of working on safety-critical systems. We'll look at mission control and range control. We do system architecture design. We'll look at system integration. We'll look at cyber. We'll look at energetic materials, and we'll look at the standoff distances, etc. And we're now building relationships with space lawyers and space insurers. And look, what we're looking to do is, if a client works with Fire Arrow, they don't need to work with anybody else. We cover the lot of it. And if there's any areas that we don't cover, then we'll find best-in-class providers to then provide it. So we want to make it as seamless and as painless for our clients to get from ideation to orbital insertion. So in terms of Scotland, so Scotland is about 10% of the UK population, but we've got about 20% of the space jobs in the UK. 10 years ago, space and space industry, really there was nothing in Scotland almost. There was a few small players, some startups, but there was really nothing there. And we've now gone almost stellar in a 10-year period. And this is a piece of work we're looking at here from UK Satellite Applications Catapult. And they looked at a number of space clusters globally. And Scotland, in terms of growth, was the one that was growing most. Now, we can't rest on our laurels. Over the next decade, we anticipate that will change. I anticipate new market entrants. I anticipate larger primes may enter the market. And I'm sure there's going to be some acquisitions as well. So we can't rest on our laurels. But again, in terms of where we were 10 years ago, we were almost nowhere. So we've got a number of nations, Malaysia, for example, looking at Scotland, looking at where we went from and where we are now in that short distance, and looking to learn with us. So we've got Malaysia looking to engage with many space companies that's been involved in that journey, and effectively exporting that knowledge and expertise and doing some knowledge transfer. So back in 2015, I was appointed by the Scottish Government to lead the industrial strategy for aerospace, defence, marine and security. And what you'll see here is space is conspicuous by its absence. And what we could see, as much as we really didn't have much of a space industry back then, there were a couple of new start companies that looked quite exciting. And the UK and Scotland were looking to establish spaceports. But again, this is when it was in its infancy. So I led that, I chaired the group. And what we decided to do is, space did get mentioned, but space was considered a subset of aerospace. Now, technically, I can almost buy that. But what we decided to do was to take space out from underneath aerospace and give it a bit of sunlight, and see how it would then flourish and grow. We created a thing called the Space Subgroup, and that morphed into an organisation called Space Scotland that I'll touch on later. So that was launched back in 2016. And then in 2021, we then launched our Space in Scotland strategy. That was looking at creating 20,000 new space jobs by 2030 and adding about 4 billion GVA. And then the following year, we created a space sustainability roadmap. We were the first country in the world to do that. So in terms of that, space for good and ethical use of space. So many of the authors of that document are all over the world, doing talks explaining that journey that we went through. So we've gone from this place of not quite nothing, but almost nothing back in 2015, even back in 2016, to a very different place in terms of where we are today. And where that's got us to is Glasgow now manufactures more small satellites than anywhere in the world outside of California. Edinburgh is viewed as Europe's data capital. And very soon we will conduct our first orbital launch from Scotland and will be Europe's launch capital. So as a small nation, we are punching well above our weight. So we created a thing called, so as I mentioned earlier, we created a space subgroup when we did the aerospace defence, marines and security industrial strategy. The subgroup then morphed into what they call the Space Scotland Leadership Council. And then that morphed into something a wee bit more snappy that was Space Scotland. And the thing about Space Scotland, it's been the glue that has held us together. It's a non-fee paying organisation. So if you want to further space, you're involved in the space industry, you're by de facto a member. So we've got small companies, we've got SMEs, we've got new starts, we've got slightly larger players, and we've got academia, and we've got Scotland's public sector, and we've also got the UK public sector as well. So that's really been the glue that's held the whole thing together. And there's a real, I would say, a real energy and a real agility in Scotland because we don't have large primes, we don't have the Lockheeds, we don't have Airbus, we don't have BAE Systems in space. I anticipate that'll change in the next 10 years. But right now we don't have it. So we've got lots and lots of entrepreneurs, all feeling the same pain and all mucking in and helping one another. So in terms of that journey at a national level, what did we think about? So some of the key considerations, we thought about the economic ecosystem. We talk about the regulatory ecosystem in terms of, well, how can we make it easy and as painless as possible to establish a space ecosystem, and particularly spaceports. Place was Scotland itself in terms of the heritage and the scenery and the haggis and everything else that comes with being in Scotland. But what else would then attract inward investment, whether it was foreign direct investment or domestic direct investment? Inclusive growth. So this is classically, it's about space for everyone. So regardless of gender, sexual preference, etc., etc. But beyond that, what we were looking at is that the backbone of Scotland's space industry is satellites, data, and launch. And that's a good starting point. And that's given us a solid footing. But then we're starting to almost widen our horizons now. We talked about bugs earlier. We've got a company in Scotland doing something very similar. But then we're looking at, well, how do we then grow sustainable food sources? How do we create oxygen or fuel in that type of environment? What about space psychology? What about space physiology? So starting to think about all these adjacent areas that's got a place in space. Investment, whether that's from private equity, venture capital, angel investment, public sector, but how do we then stimulate the economy? Particularly when we've got with Scotland, we've never been short of inventors and innovators. What we're not so good at is scaling. So we've got a fat front end in terms of a pipeline, lots of small companies with fantastic ideas, but not necessarily scaling. And that might be due to availability of investment. So how do we then seed that and how do we then stimulate that? Innovation and R&D, either at a company level or an academic level. Again, Scotland's got a very long heritage in space and academia. I mean, we do some things and it's almost, we're flying under the radar. We do some really great things within academia that sometimes academia doesn't even know it's doing itself. So we're starting to put a wee bit of light on that, looking at the good work that we're doing and celebrating that, equally looking at opportunities to collaborate between companies and entrepreneurs and academia. And I know personally, in terms of my software business, I'm doing a project right now and we're looking at human-computer interface, we're looking at large language models, we're looking at machine learning, we're looking at how we fuse all that together with human situational awareness. So I had some ideas, but bringing academia into that just brought a very, very different perspective to it. And infrastructure. So if we're going to go and attract potential anchor customers and anchor businesses in, we need to be able to accommodate them. So either we've got the investment to then build new buildings for them, or we've got existing building stock. So again, we need to have the infrastructure to do that. And we came to a bit of a pinch point where companies want to set up in Scotland, but we didn't necessarily have sufficient building stock in the right place to support them and accommodate them. And then one that's very close to my heart is education, skills, workforce development, and STEAM. And again, that's really important. And I think particularly in space, I think space has still got this view. There's lots of people running about labs with white coats on, maybe people with grey beards and PhDs. Now, we need those type of people, but we need welders, we need project managers, we need logisticians, we need all these different skills to support the growth of the ecosystem. So one of the things we're looking at is how do we then build a bridge from young people and having that aspiration and dream and desire to be working in the space industry and realise that they can and realise there's a place for them. So I think we've got a bit of a PR issue that we need to overcome. So that was us looking at Scotland at an economic level from where we came from back in 2015, that we almost did nothing to write about, to where we are now, where we're really punching above our weight. And we intend to continue on that trajectory. But again, we can't rest on our laurels. It's not just going to happen on its own. So this is what Fire Arrow does. So this is our life cycle. So it's a game of two halves. So at one end, we've got conceptualization, and at the back end, we've got realization. So in terms of some of the things that we go through in our life cycle, we get involved with spaceports at an early stage. So we'll do discovery. We'll start to look at option identification, option down selection. We'll look at a concept of operation, start to do some outline design, outline requirements. We'll then look at both the technical feasibility and commercial viability. So, does it adhere with the laws of physics? And financially, does it actually wash its face? We then start to look at some detailed design. We start to look at licenses. We'll look at consents. And then we get into integration. Now, system integration, in my experience, is almost a neglected part of, I would say, spaceports. So me as an engineer, as a system engineer, I think of all the different component parts, all the different elements, how they sit within the safety argument. How does that then become part of a safety case? And how do you then demonstrate that to the regulator that all the component parts come together as a coherent whole? And what you don't want to do is to get to the integration phase and realise you've not thought about those things. So it's important to think about how you join all of the dots at the earliest possible opportunity. So that's then about how do we then build it. It's not just the physical infrastructure, it is your systems and services and people and vendors, but it's all those component parts within the system or system of systems to make sure that you conduct missions successfully, but equally safely. And then finally, we're launch ready, and then we can prosecute missions. And really what I'm going to talk about tonight is really that front end. So it's all about, let's say, the economic case, but I'm calling it the investment case here, and that'll become clearer in the next slide. So we'll talk about the front end. How do we go from that ideation phase to the point where we've got a thumbs up and we can move forward into realization? So in terms of kicking the tires of a spaceport, to me, there's four key elements. So we've got what your desired outcomes. Why do you want to do this in the first place? Is it strategic? Is it a vanity project? What is it? What's that driving thing that's compelling you to have a spaceport? Then what are your strategic considerations, technical feasibility and commercial viability? And then you get to a decision point. And at the end of that, then you move on to the realization. That's when you can start to put shovels in grounds and pour concrete and put the steel up and do all that type of thing. So at the front end, in terms of your desired outcomes, so you want to establish a skills pipeline. So what you don't want to do is to attract foreign direct investors and they come to a place where the skill set isn't there to enable them to then build a solvent business around it. So we need to make sure that we've got skills and a skills pipeline for our anchor employers and anchor tenants. They will then want to go out and attract foreign direct investment or domestic direct investment. So how do we actually go about it? What type of companies do we want to attract? Because one of the things that I have seen in the UK is almost a bit of a patchwork quilt. And it's almost like, let's attract any space company. And most strategically, it might well be that what you want to do is launch and satellite building. Maybe that is the basis of your cluster. Then you can start to build the supply chain around them. So I think you want to make some strategic choices in terms of what do we want this space cluster to be famous for. So again, there's always a danger that you take almost all comers, but potentially you may end up with a bit of an incoherent patchwork quilt, albeit they're all in space. Then starting to build out that industry footprint with those anchor employers, and then starting to build your local supply chain. So whether that's people doing machining or fabrication or welding or environmental testing, but it's almost that tier 2 How do you then support those tier one organisations? Then how do we then stimulate research and technology and development? And whether that's at a company level, whether it's within academia, or whether it's collaboration. And then how do we then leverage public and private funding to then support additional growth and entrepreneurship and new startup companies to then start to build that ecosystem and building that cluster? So in terms of your considerations, you're looking at then your scoping options and you're looking at your scenarios. So it might well be that we want to go for a big bang, or we do nothing, or we're limited by our funding. But what are those scenarios? So you may want to look at your service solution, your service solution options, your service delivery options, your implementation options, your funding options, and collaboration options. And again, in the UK, we've got 15 clusters up and down the UK. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say they're not playing nice, but not necessarily working together as well as we might. And I think that's now slowly changing. You know, I think that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So we recognise that by collaborating, it's of a mutual benefit. And we're now starting to see that more and more in the UK. So as much as I think we've got quite a tight knit community in Scotland, less so across the UK, but we're now starting to change that, which is good for UK PLC. In terms of feasibility and viability, then we start to look at the strategic case. So what is the case for change? Why do you want a spaceport in the first place? You know, what level of inward investment would you need to attract to make this thing commercially viable? And what are your critical success factors? In terms of your economic case, you're looking at your economic impact assessment. You then look at your gross domestic product. You look at your gross value add, your number of your jobs that you're creating, and then what tax income do they then contribute to the treasury? Your commercial case, you'll then start to look at your partners. So who will be your launch service provider? Who will be the launch vehicle provider? Who will be a spaceport operator? And who will be a range control service provider? You'll then come up with some sort of outline con-ops in terms of how you stitch all that together. And then you'll do some level of diligence. Now, whatever that means, I'm suggesting a diligence light here. But what you want to do is if you select a partner, particularly the launch operator, well, do they have a feasible solution? Are they solvent? Are the people behind the company? You know, are that the type of people you want to be working in? So you want to do some sort of at least light background checks. And then you want to understand, you know, what is that target accessible market, addressable market, and a serviceable addressable market? You know, what are the market conditions? Do you see growth? Is it larger sats? Is it picosats? What is it based on that solution? And then what does that market look like? In your delivery case, you're then starting to say, okay, we're now beyond the conceptualization, we're getting to realization. Well, how are we going to govern that as a project? How do we manage risk? How do we manage compliance? What would that build and delivery strategy look like? How do we then realize the benefits? How do we then capture the benefits and look at your KPIs that you use? And then who will be the people actually go and do it? So who is that project director, a project team, or, you know, who's that consortium of subject matter experts that you'll then bring in to then start to realize your ambition and then start to bring this thing out of the ground, create the physical environment, but also everything that goes behind it in terms of your safety case, your systems and processes, etc. And then finally, you get a financial case. So your sensitivity analysis based on the market conditions, your return on investment, your cost base, or benefit cost ratio, and then any funding required. Do you have sufficient funding, or do you have to go out and raise? And to me, not just the economic case, all of these things are part of your investment case. So effectively, in our experience, each of these things would then be chapters within your investment case. Now, the economic case is part of it. You might call the whole thing an economic case, and the commercial case and delivery case all sits as part of it. It's semantics, but what it's saying is all those elements will feature in that case. And once you've got that, then you get to a decision point. So it might well be that you've got sufficient evidence and you've got a compelling case to say, go. So go beyond that gate and start to move into realization and start to move into build, or stop and say, okay, we don't have sufficient basis. It doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make financial sense. So it may well be we'll have to go and have a rethink, or it might be a case of reworking the investment case. Or you might do a facts-based trade-off and saying, well, it's not quite 100%, but it's near enough. And based on our risk appetite, we're happy to allow it to go through the gate, but we recognise there's things that we'll do beyond the gate during the realisation phase, but it's not going to have a material risk on the project overall. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, both in terms of Scotland as a new space nation and what we did in terms of the economic levers at a national level. And then from a spaceport perspective, some of the more tactical and technical things will then look to get to that point where we get to a go decision and then we move into the project realization. So that's me. So firstly, thanks very much for listening, and hopefully that was useful.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And let's get some questions.
You said so many great things, which is just aligned with our projects, from our starting with our desired outcomes, and I'll tell a bit about why, but also just based on who we're starting with, which is, and to develop the skilled trades. When you talk about welders, could you elaborate on the role of welders and how they fit in specifically into, obviously with specialized training, into the space technology area?
Absolutely. So, I'll declare my interest. I was a welder, so I was a shipyard welder. So maybe some bias in there. So an example would be, so there's Sky Aurora, Izzy had mentioned earlier. So Sky Aurora are using additive layer manufacture to build their rocket components, which is fine. But at some point in time, you then need to bring those component parts together and weld them. And it's quite an exotic material. And of course, anything in space is deemed as, this is a problem we've never encountered before. So they couldn't find welders with sufficient experience or codes to actually go and weld these things up. And what they actually did is they actually reached back into Scotland's heritage, and they went to this small welding company that had been around for about 40 years, and they used a TIG welding process or a TAGS welding process, and very quickly they could weld it. But what they initially they hit almost a brick wall and said, well, we've got this new space welding problem, and in reality they didn't. But what it recognized was, when you start to then make these things at volume, do we have a sufficient number of coded welders or people with that expertise to, so when you're doing 1 and 2 and it's a bit of a cottage industry, you can do that. If you're then starting to do it at scale and do it at volume, then that's a slightly different proposition. So again, I think in terms of where we are from a skills perspective, even in terms of, we make more satellites than anywhere else outside of California. Again, as we start to then do that and we start to productionize that at scale, that'll then create about a pinch point in terms of the skills that we actually require. So that was the example of a welder, because the materials we're using in metallurgy, it can be quite exotic materials. So do we actually have people that's got that skill and expertise to do it?
Thank you.
And I think to that point, I think, again, I've talked about it in Scotland a lot. We tend to talk about graduates and we talk about postdocs. And I thought, okay, in terms of where Scotland is, I can understand why the conversation is going that way. But if we then start to project ourselves 10 years down the line and we look at a lot of these new start companies, say, okay, they're now starting to grow and they're now starting to scale, then we'll still need postgrads, we'll need postdocs, we'll need those people. But to me, at the moment, they're a large proportion of our space workforce in Scotland. And I see over time that will become still important, but it'll be a smaller proportion, because you then need those technicians. You need people, simply people who can solder. And we had a bit of an issue with that, where we didn't have people who were training people to solder. So it's all those kind of, I wouldn't call them basic things, but things that people are almost, not considering it's important because it's not spacey. Those are the things potentially that could derail you. So I think it's starting to future-proof and say, okay, we're now going to be successful. In 10 years, we're going to be here. What does that landscape look like? And can we support that in terms of a skills pipeline?
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because, like you said, you have a PR problem. So space needs a lot of PR people. And that's why I do what I do, is to help. Space is for everyone. It's an ecosystem. Just like you have all the positions here on planet, you're going to need all those same positions no matter where we go.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I've said to Scotland's Economic Agency is stop referring to space as a sector, call space a place. So if somebody said to me, what sector do you work in, Mick? I say, yeah, Earth. I work in Earth. Well, what part? Well, I work in software development. So to me, I think we now need to start to open space up, and not because I think when we talk about it as a sector, immediately people default back to satellites, data, and rockets. Full stop. And I'm saying no, it's much wider than that. So we need to just open our minds and open our eyes to, I think, the immensity of the opportunity that's presented before us.
So, all right. Is there any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, I was
I got
gonna
a question, Mick. Go ahead, Tim.
Okay.
yeah, I was gonna ask, I know on a lot of the SpaceX launches we see somewhere up towards the British Isles is like the last kind of abort phase. Has that given you kind of an advantage being in that geographic location for kind of like their last kind of their last chance to return to Earth before achieving orbit?
I think it possibly does. It's never been held up as a significant, USP or lever at all. We were almost a diversionary. Prestwick that I worked on was a diversionary airport for the shuttle. Never happened, but it was there. So we've always had that heritage and that involvement. But it's never been held up as any kind of differentiator.
Okay. Ben.
Mick, I got a quick question. Obviously the hurdles that Paul is going to have are different from the hurdles that they had in New Mexico and so on and so forth. Culturally, what are the biggest hurdles in an island like Scotland?
I think that in terms of, I think in my experience, and I think as I touched on earlier, and as I touched on in terms of let's say the PR issue that we've got, is when you started to talk to people about space, you could almost see them starting to glaze over because they thought, like, I don't understand space. So that even though a lot of what we would talk about, we're doing that terrestrially as well, so they would understand it, but almost their brain switched off and they didn't engage in the conversation. So we had lots and lots of conversations like that. So I think we're very much, if you look at almost that life cycle, we're very much in that innovator stage. We've not got to the early majority and late majority. We're not in that stage yet. So I think culturally, I think part of the responsibility we've got is not to talk about space in terms that people don't understand. How do we engage people? How do we make them not fear being involved in space? So to me, I think language, I think is part of it. So people realise, I think to Izzy's point, that space is for everyone. So how do we make it more inclusive? So I think that's part of it. I think beyond that, in terms of what we're doing in Scotland, so in the UK we've got 7 spaceports. All of them may not come to fruition, but 5 of the 7 are in Scotland. Prestwick, for example, is very close to Glasgow. It's very well connected. It's got motorways. It's got an airport. It's got a seaport. It's got a train link, a train head that almost goes right into the airport. So that's at one extreme, and then you've got Saxaboard, which is at the very northern tip of the northern part of Scotland, which is in Shetland, which is closer. It's probably closer to Norway than it is Glasgow, which is a great place to launch in terms of your arc of fire and your azimuth, but it's very far away. So I think culturally you've got almost this urban community around Glasgow. And you've got access to lots of skills. And then what you've got is this very rural area. So they've got a slightly greater challenge because I think, as we touched on earlier, because it's a vertical launch solution, you're looking to launch from a place of low population density, which is great technically, but can you attract the right skills and workforce to be there? Now, it's a beautiful part of the world, but if you're trying to attract young engineers who are looking for the bright lights of the city, and you go to one of these islands, then you've got a very small population. So I think there's some cultural issues in terms of the place, but I think the important thing for me is how do you engage and include your population in the space industry? And as I said, part of that to me is us being cautious of the language we use inclusive language, and help people through that journey so they understand what space is and what the opportunity can mean to them.
Yeah, I think Izzy and I cracked up the second you said that the eyes glaze over, because we've been through that for about 7 years now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think
And-
it's important that you use something that they can relate to. Like one
Absolutely.
of the things that I always say is that you have space in your pocket with your phone.
Yeah.
And so that kind of puts it, oh, well, that
Yeah.
does relate to me.
Yeah,
And,
absolutely. And I think it was going back to the welding question that, at the moment, pretty much everything that's in space was made on Earth. Now, there'll come a point where things will be made in space as well, but at the moment, everything's made on Earth. So we need people who can weld, we need people who can solder, we need finance people, we need PR people, we need all these skills. And a lot of people are doing those, they've got those skills and doing that job today, but they're in a different industry. So whether they're working in shipbuilding or automotive or wherever they are, it doesn't matter, but they're doing that today. And they would probably never think in their wildest dreams that I can do the job I'm doing today, that I'm skilled at and I'm competent at in space. And I think when we
Right.
start to open that up, you can see, well, rather than glazing over, you can see almost that glint in their eyes saying, wow, I'm doing something I'm fascinated by, and doing something that, I already can do.
exactly. So, all right. Well, Stuart had kind of had to pop off real quick because, like I said, he just became a new daddy for the third time. So he had an issue that he had to go take care of. And so we're going to go ahead and go to Paul. And Paul has worked extensively in areas of marketing, strategy planning, communications, branding, and business development. And his private sector experience includes work with a wide range of luxury resorts and hotels, which we do need in space as well. That's the whole space tourism aspect. And airlines, cruise lines, as well as travel-related retail. Paul's client brands have included, and there's a lot of names here I can't pronounce, words there that were
just say a bunch of booze. It's fine.
a bunch of booze. We can relate to that in Kentucky. We have bourbon. He has a Master of Tourism Administration degree from the George Washington University School of Business with specializations in marketing and sustainable tourism development, as well as professional certification in destination management from the International Institute for Tourism Studies in conjunction with United Nations World Tourism Organization. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you for that introduction. I didn't know you were going to read all that. So just as a bit of clarification, a lot of my background is obviously a bit in marketing and tourism. Paso Robles is my hometown, but up until just a few years ago, my last job was I was the CEO for the National Tourism Office of Tahiti in the South Pacific. So that's where all those French sounding names come from. And we also had part of my career, we had a marketing agency where we had a lot of cool alcohol brands, including Jack Daniels. We were the agency of record for Jack Daniels in Tahiti. So that's where comes from. So I moved back home to my hometown of Paso Robles. And if you're not familiar with, we're a small town. We're exactly halfway between LA and San Francisco on the Central Coast. And it's an agricultural community, farms and ranches since forever. One of the crops that we've become most famous for are grapes and our wine. So we've become very well known as a wine region. We have 32,000 people, a little over 300 wineries. So I like to joke that's a ratio every community should strive for. And last year in 2023, as you can see there, we were voted best wine region in the USA. So we're very proud of that. With the wine came the tourists, very successful area for us as well. So we're still a small farm town with 300 wineries and 5 Michelin restaurants. So go figure that. And that is where we're getting a lot of investment. So our current economy, you can see there, because of our success in the tourism sector, we're attracting a lot of investment. We have over 1,000 new hotel rooms in the pipeline. In that context, city leadership said we need to make sure we support these two very important sectors, which is wine and tourism. We need to work to diversify our economy for greater economic stability and also to attract jobs that may pay more than service sectors, which become challenging to match the cost of living. So we began looking at technology. And I'll preface all this, we never set out to make a spaceport. So that is our beginning. So we were looking at ag tech, naturally, and medical technologies. And that's when we were approached by a university which is located near us. It's the California Polytechnic State University, or Cal Poly for short, with the idea of using our municipal airport to apply for an FAA spaceport license for horizontal launch. So this is our airport, exactly how it looks. The town's off in the distance. It's a former military airfield that the city acquired for $1 back in 1973. And today it functions as a general aviation airport. I landed there just a few hours ago. I was up, our mayor is also a private pilot, and we were up at the state capitol in Sacramento for some meetings on space, and we just flew back into Paso. So that's basically what it is. Tourists fly in, but also it's just mostly local pilots. So the idea would be to use this for as a horizontal platform. A little bit about Cal Poly. They are a top engineering school here on the West Coast. They have 14 different types of engineering degrees, including aerospace. And they're also, if you're not familiar with them, they co-invented CubeSats with Stanford University back in the 90s. And they were inducted into the Space Technology Hall of Fame in 2022. And it's really funny because they're 25 minutes away, and literally till we started this, no one knew that, because engineers desperately need people like Izzy to communicate, because they're just not good at talking to people. We're like, how could this be so famous and no one knows about it? Well, they do now. We formed this partnership. Cal Poly's challenge was getting their project right into space. They'd have students that would design and build CubeSats. They'd wait 3 to 5 years to get a lift, and by that time they'd be gone from school, etc. So they were looking to have something where they could sort of be focused on the academic side of space. And on our part, we were looking as a way of developing just what Dr. O'Connor talked about, which is just sort of skilled jobs and things. So there's a picture of our mayor at the time, Mayor Martin, and the president of the university putting the deal together as partners. Our focus is specifically educational access to space, and for all those reasons that we talked about. So unlike, there's always a commercial aspect, but it's literally servicing that development of the workforce. We have, we call it K-20, kindergarten through level 20. So certainly the advanced degrees, but also the technician levels that we keep hearing more and more about. At a conference I was at recently, I liked how they said, we need people who can build things and fix things. I think it's a very practical way of saying it. The reason I asked about the welding, like in our high school, we have excellent industrial arts welding program. I spoke with the principal of the high school. And he says after that, the kids don't see where they go after high school. If they're not on a 4-year engineering track, they build a barbecue, they sell it as a project, and that's kind of it. So if we can connect that vision, like talk about the eyes glazing over, if you can get them to see a path forward, that's really our biggest challenge, and that's where the communication, like what Izzy and Ben are doing, is so important. This is our team that working on from Cal Poly, working with the students and some of the leadership, myself, and then our airport manager, Mark Scandalis. The student lead in the upper left-hand corner, Matthew, he graduated and 10 seconds later was hired by SpaceX. So that just shows you the quality of kids coming out of the university, really, really smart people. And Miriam on the upper right, she came up with the logo for our spaceport project, which is kind of fun. In addition to the spaceport licensing, which is in process, so it's a lengthy process, we're working on what we call our tech corridor, and that's sort of the magenta line. So we have the airport area, which is about 1,300 acres. Sorry, I don't have it hectares on the top of mind. But the areas in the green boxes around are private sector developments, developers that are creating business park and tech parks simply around the idea of the spaceport. So it's bringing in private sector development, and it could be for any kind of business technology, but having the idea of a spaceport as a core is already attracting that. So they're working their way through the development process. Some of it will be build to suits structures, some will just be lots that people can buy, etc. So as was mentioned, if you don't have a place to attract business to, it's difficult to do the business attraction. So that's in the pipeline as well. What we are working on our side is on the airport proper. Project that we did was we used recycled asphalt from road repairs around the city, and we reconstituted the access to a very remote part of the airfield. There's a lot of remote parts. We created a test site where companies can test their propulsion systems. And that's our current mayor out there, Mayor Hammond, standing on the access way. And on the right-hand side with some of the young engineers who are out testing the program. We have our first tenant out using the test site, which is Stellar Exploration. On the left is Dr. Thomas Svitek, and he's holding 2 examples of his micro propulsion systems that his company designs and builds. Stellar was involved with designing and building the propulsion system for Capstone, NASA's project, which has been orbiting the moon for the last 18 months. And they're currently working on things for Artemis. So we're happy that a little town in the Central Coast has our little toehold in the space sector. We're looking to expand the test site so we can have more companies come in. That's sort of the lowest hanging fruit for us while we work through the licensing, as well as we work with the private developers on sort of the business park aspects. In our toolkit, as you saw, we have lots of big flat dirt, which is great, but what we don't have as a small town are financial resources for incentives, things like that. So we have reached out to the state of California, who has those things. They can offer tax incentives and tax credits and things, and especially for foreign direct investment, as was mentioned earlier. They've just become our partner. When people are talking to us, we can say, here's your contact at the state level to see what kind of things might be possible if you want to expand or to bring your business here. And about a month ago, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and it's called GoBiz for short, they said, how many people have actually reached out to you? And I hadn't actually done the list, so I looked it up and sent it to them. And to date, we've had 23 companies show some level of interest in our project. 2 of them we have signed NDAs with. We have 6 signed letters of intent. And of the 23 companies, 10 are international companies and 13 are based here in the US. A common theme with the international companies was that they already have customers in the US, and they realized that they could expand that part of their business by having an actual physical presence here. And so if you look at a map, we're like 2.5 hours south of Silicon Valley and about an hour and a half north of Vandenberg. So we're just this kind of central to everything. In addition to Cal Poly, which is located right here, and Cuesta College is a community college here locally as well that specializes in 1- and 2-year technical training programs. We've also had interest from several academic organizations, including Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, Arizona State University, and most recently, the Center for Astronautical Physics and Engineering from the National Central University of Taiwan. Of the international companies, they've come to us from Spain and Netherlands, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, Canada, and most recently, Bulgaria. Last month, we had a delegation of tech companies come here. They weren't just coming to Paso Robles. We were just one stop on their visit along in California. But it's interesting to us that at least we're in the consideration set. The group was led by Milena Stoicheva, who's the chair of the Board of Innovation for the Ministry of Innovation and Growth in the Republic of Bulgaria. She's very familiar with California. She likes it very much because she studied at UC Berkeley up in the Bay Area, also at MIT. So she's quite tech savvy. So what's interesting for us is with these companies exhibiting interest, the town hasn't spent any money on marketing. So everything the attention that we've gotten so far has just been from word of mouth or from some media articles. Locally, we were also picked up on NPR National Public Radio on something called All Things Considered. They just thought it was funny. They said, from a tractor pull to a spaceport. If you're not full of tractor pull, it's a farm competition. But so they just thought it was this little town jumping straight out of the fields into space. And also, the third part of us is networking at conferences. So the city manager and I attended Commercial Space Week this year for our first time. Izzy got to show us around, and we met so many cool people, and just not only did we learn a lot from that, it was a great conference, but just the networking and the sharing of ideas, listening to the things that people have gone through and the ideas, that was super interesting. A little bit more just about our town and how we're slowly working our way through it. Again, we're not in a rush. Our economy is actually doing quite well. It's not an urgent thing with the sectors we have, but we are working to have this move forward. If you want to have any kind of tech, you need to have great connectivity. So last year, we partnered with the town next to us called Atascadero, and to create the North County broadband strategic plan. And because we were 2 towns, we counted as a regional project, so we were able to get a grant from the state of California, and which paid for the whole thing, which was great, to develop a broadband strategic plan for our 2 communities to help us become even more wired. And we just found out that the plan has won an award from the California Association for Local Economic Development. And someone's coming down from Sacramento next week to our city council on Tuesday to give the city the award. So that's kind of fun. Also, when we're talking about economic development in general, one thing that always comes up is housing. So we have the good fortune to be a little ahead of the curve as far as that goes with housing developments, which are already approved and in process. This is 4,000 homes over a period of time, but the first 12 or 1,300 are already in construction. So we have the homes in process, which is a really important part because a lot of times you can have other parts, but people need a place to live. So we're slowly getting our ducks in order. And also we've just completed a 5-year economic development strategic plan. It's the first strategic document. The last one the city did was 18 years ago in 2006. A few things have happened since then. And within that, we work with our various stakeholder group, the Chamber of Commerce, our Hispanic Business Association, our Wine Alliance, et cetera, our tourism office, to take all these various things. And in that, the Spaceport and Tech Corridor is one of our core initiatives for really moving our community and our economy forward over the next 20 years. And last but not least, we have here, since of our location, the state of California every year has here in our town the California Mid-State Fair. It's right in the middle of the state. And we're a small town, but in over 12 days, we have 350,000 people come to the fairgrounds. And the theme this year, which we had nothing to do with, is wide open spaces, which is cowboy boots and then like planets and flying saucers. And so they've reached out to us. They gave us a series of display windows to put up information about what is a spaceport, what is horizontal launch, what is a CubeSat. And so we're partnering with the university and with some other economic things with a space plane company, et cetera, to try and have some educational posters and whatnot, and some QR codes where people can listen to some videos with some explanations. And so we were kind of fun reaching out. One of the things they say is community support, and that was one of the first things that we were able to check off the box when the vice president of the university and I were presenting this idea to city council. We've been doing this for just a little over 3 years. We started in February of 2021. The city council chambers were full of people who were there to complain about an increase in sewer rates or something like that. And when we finished our presentation, the way it works here, you have public comment, and so people could stand up at the microphone and say what they want. And they started standing up saying, "This is fantastic. My kids can have a job. My grandkids don't have to leave." And the vice president of the university says, "Did you bring these people here?" And I said, "I don't even know who they are." And at the break, and that's been, they all came up to us, and that has been the theme that it's resonated with people, whether they went to college or not, or university or not, is the fact that these are jobs that means our families can actually stay here, and we don't have to, because if you go to university, there's a chance you won't come back. The jobs aren't here. If you stay here and you have a service level job, you may not be able to afford a house to stay here with your family. So it's immediately people make the connection. So we have the parts. Our project is really just connecting dots that are already there. Everything Dr. O'Connor was saying, I was taking big notes there about the welding, the technician level things, as well as the more advanced training with the university, and having other universities be with us. And our part of the ecosystem, like I said, is educational access to space, and that's where we hope to be helping to support and build the workforce for tomorrow. With that, I would be happy to take any questions.
I have a quick one here. What has been your biggest challenge with taking on this initiative?
Biggest challenge? Well, we don't have a budget yet, so there's that. But
That's a big one.
we're working on it. I would say just getting up and running, learning what it is, getting out there. The community was behind it, getting sort of government to get in the mindset. It's a big departure from what we have been doing in the past. And that's really understanding what are the steps. There's a lot of misperceptions about what it means. We had to make sure the private pilots knew this is not an end to general aviation. We had to explain that it's not SpaceX blasting off in your backyard, right? Although we can see SpaceX from here when it goes off at Vandenberg. It's kind of fun from a distance, and so making sure that people knew what it is and what it isn't, and that's just communication. That's, reaching out to people. And we do a lot of outreach, speaking at Rotary Club and things like that. And the more people learn about it, the more excited they get. And now a lot of people reach out to us to find out where we're going. I just spoke to our planning commission last week to have the updates. So I'd say the biggest challenge was right now, as this is advancing, because we don't really need a spaceport license necessarily to attract business, but it's obviously a great thing to have. But as we're working through the license, is getting the business park areas. Like, you have to have that place for businesses to come to. We have these signed letters of intent of companies saying they want to be here, and we're like, look at all the big flat dirt, but there's not a here just yet. And so luckily the city doesn't have to pay for it. We work with these developers. It's all coming together in its own timeline. It looks like 2026 will be a pretty interesting convergence, but it's just sort of as we, try to get all those, we're building the chicken and the egg at the same time. But that's really it. It hasn't been any huge challenges. We put a little bit of money into it. We spent $22,000 with an engineering firm to do a preliminary technical review very early on to see if it's doable, feasible, and it is. And like, we're not building anything, we're repurposing existing infrastructure. And we have the talent pipeline, literally with the headwaters of the talent pipeline with the university. And the majority of university students would like to stay here if they could, but they leave because the jobs are not here. So there's a lot of cool things. And so we're just trying to bring them all together. And that's why I love hearing from these people. Like, when I hear these things about welders, because it makes sense to me. I'm a kid coming out of high school that doesn't go to college, but he's an excellent welder. He's going to be welding fence pipe, out on a ranch somewhere, which is great. But if he could be doing something on a satellite and supporting his family, that's what we're looking for.
So I see some mics have gone off, so let's go ahead and take some other questions.
I think one for me, Paul, so thanks very much for that. In terms of Cal Poly, I was having a conversation about Cal Poly this morning, believe it or not. So in terms of where Glasgow has got to, Cal Poly helped us to get to that point. So that's one. Secondly, the winery that was in the top left-hand corner, I've been in that winery en route to Cayucos.
Nice.
Which is beautiful. So the more serious question is in terms of the horizontal launch platform that we'd use, have you identified what that platform would be yet?
Yes, one of the NDAs is with a horizontal launch company, and so that they have provided us the technical specifications for our application.
Yeah.
We have some great consultants, one of whom was involved with getting Colorado their spaceport license, and they had to use a Concept X. It was just sort of a theoretical craft, whereas we have actually something.
Yeah.
It's just painful that we can't say the name, but that's how it is. But anyway, the idea of those types of things, and as I've talked with Izzy and with Arturo from Houston, and our mayor was just in Cecil, what people have realized is that with horizontal launch, no one's really launched anything except the big stuff out at Mojave. But it's created, as Izzy was saying, that huge economic impact because it creates its own center of gravity.
Yeah,
and we're in a position for when it becomes viable. But just the fact that we're talking about getting a spaceport license and we have companies coming to us with literally no expenditure. But that's so funny that you're clear across the other side of the world and you have two of the things out of my presentation are like, you already know what they are. That's really awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I will say the Spanish company, UARX is their name, and they signed one of our first letters of intent. And they were very excited because the two co-founders did their master's degrees at Cal Poly. And they fell in love with the area, and they were looking for a way to expand. And they says, we'd love to be there, but we have no idea when they were students how we would ever be able to have something there. And then it's just for them, it sort of came together as well. It's still a small world, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was basically going to be my question. You kind of hit on Mojave, Spaceport America, Virgin Galactic is really the only one I know of who's doing horizontal launches and landings, and they're just doing tests and landing back at where they launched from. So you being kind of nearby seems like a prime destination for them.
Last Spaceport Kentucky's we had horizontal launch vehicles, and there's a company out in New Zealand, that Dawn Aerospace, that they have an aircraft that is like it's a big RC, like 12 feet long. It doesn't have a human in it, and it can fly into the atmosphere. So you have those type of scientific vehicles that can launch from a horizontal. You have the balloons that can launch from a horizontal. So you have like space perspectives, or you have some other type of balloon types of situations for scientific research. And then there's the space planes that will be coming in, so they can land at a horizontal launch area as well. And I do want to touch on a very big component that I think is important to anybody that's looking at doing a spaceport is that there, you said low hanging fruit, doing the testing facility. So you want to go a little bit more into that and how that's low hanging fruit and how
Yep,
affordable that is to get money coming in.
absolutely. And on, for example, the space plane you were talking about, they don't even there was a great presentation that they did, and we've spoken with them a fair bit. They offer even captive flights for, let's say you have a CubeSat, you put your sensors on it, you can fly it up into microgravity, test your sensors, and you have your data back in 30 minutes. You don't have to launch something and see if it works. So you can test it and test it and test it before you actually launch. And something I have just learned about recently is the biomedical field that is very interested in microgravity.
Yeah.
And those are the types of vehicles that they're really interested in, because you can go up, and I think with that coming, they can do like 3.5 minutes of microgravity, something like that. And I'm not sure how it works, but yeah. So it's not just launch. You don't need to have full things, but just having that capacity that you can do testing of your sensors, and then let's say you finish your satellite, get it on the chassis, and ship it down to Vandenberg for SpaceX. So the testing site, it's low hanging fruit simply because the areas were already there. These are big concrete pads that were built to hold bombers in World War II. And we just had to rebuild the road to get out there. So they're out in the middle of nowhere. And companies need a place to go and test things. And they can go out to Mojave. It's difficult for international companies, they have told us, on Vandenberg because it's a military installation. And if it's a US company with international clients, it becomes challenging, which is just the way it is, which is part of the reason why we've had so much international interest. So Stellar Exploration actually approached us simply because we were convenient to them. And as far as our business model, we're super expensive. We charge $150 a day, a really hard barrier to get in. But also a big challenge they had was they had to schlep all their stuff to wherever they're testing and set up and break down. And we just let them store the containers for $100 a month. And so Stellar's got one container, which is their control room, and one with all their equipment. So whenever they're testing, and they're bringing their clients and vendors up, which gives us great. Boeing's been out there, Frontier's been out there, and so they can set up and run their tests and they put everything away. And we put in a gate with a code on the back. We just say, close the gate when you leave. Welcome to Paso. So we're pretty easy as far as that goes. Low hanging fruit literally is we ask them how can we make this a great test facility for you? And then word of mouth is other people want to use that kind of thing. So we're looking to expand our testing facilities. We have to put some amenities out there, like, plumbing, things like that. It's kind of remote, but they typically bring those, things with them. But yeah, that's what I mean by the easiest access for us to have something we can sell and market right now.
And you also talked about tax incentives and tax credits. What kind of things are those, and how do you find out about them? How do you access them, etc.?
So for California, it's literally GoBiz, or the governor's office of business and economic development, and they have a foreign direct investment office. And so we just send it to them, and they talk to people what they're planning to do. Are they expanding? Are they bringing a business over? And so you can get the tax credits or incentive programs. There's a bunch of them, and they'll work with the companies to find out what is their situation and how they can help it. Because the reality is, and we know this, no one's moving from Texas to California. We've talked about that. That's just the way it is. We might get people moving the Central Coast from LA or San Francisco to get out of the sort of the urban areas. But it's going to be that, or it's going to be international companies. And so California, the Foreign Direct Investment Office, is excited that we're attracting those kinds of people, having those conversations. So we hand them off to those folks. They likewise came to us and said, we want to be, the people that answer those questions for us. So it's really pretty easy. We just partnered with our state office because honestly, it's kind of complicated, foreign tax credits and things like that. So there's people that do that for a living.
Very good. Very
Does
good.
Kentucky have something like that?
We have an economic development corporation, and I don't know about the rest.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's
The
why I
more
was
I look
asking the
into,
question. Yes.
yeah, the more I look into individual states, the difference at the very basic level is very negligible. Everyone offers certain level of tax incentives and credits. Yeah. California is more brutal than most just because
Yeah.
they don't need to attract. They just don't.
Well, that's what they tell themselves, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Kentucky has a big tourism thing. That's how we ended up with things like the Creation Museum and the Ark. So
Okay.
Any plans to extend that runway? It looks like
we
it's
have the
6,000.
land. Correct. The big one is the long one is 6,000. The short one's 4,300, something like that. We have land. We can extend if we need to. The city owns, and then beyond it, it's just more agricultural land. So we could extend if we want to. The launch platform we're partnered with only needs 3,000 feet to take off, and
There you go.
yeah. So
That's
we were
low hanging
sort of
fruit right there.
right. We were trying to see what what fits in the box, and that's sort of what we're looking at. Virgin, the one that went out of business, was that Orbit, a galactic
Orbit.
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 They actually approached us 2 years ago, and we just said you're too big and too heavy. A 747 can't land. 737 can, but a 747 couldn't. And we said, get a smaller launch vehicle. You're welcome. We'll give you the keys. But yeah, they wanted to see if they could find a place that wasn't in Mojave. But yeah, so we have a limit as far as that goes. We're not planning to expand it if we can stay small. And that company's business model is as they go to their next version is roughly the size of a small Gulfstream, which still we have Gulfstreams flying in and out here all the time for tourism. So we've sort of got that part covered, hopefully.
So what is the
Thanks for-
requirement for a runway? In my research, I've looked at it's about 5,000 feet for a runway for a lot of spaceport
7,000.
stuff.
7,000.
7,000. Okay, good to know. Another thing that spaceports can do no matter where, and this is coming online pretty quick, is point-to-point transportation. So once the NASA is working on something called the Quest X-59, it takes supersonic aircraft and it quiets the boom. And once that technology happens, they're going to be doing a test in about a year. They've got the aircraft finished. Then that's going to change the regulations on whether or not supersonic can fly over land. And once that happens, then we'll be able to go very fast in airplanes, and spaceports are going to be a key to point, as well as Starship that's going to be doing point, where they're coming back and landing. That's a different point, obviously aircraft versus rocket. But so point is one of those industries that's on the tipping point as well. We all know each other. Most of us know each other. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'll connect you with the appropriate person. And we will help you get your spaceport going. So, and I want to thank you both. Say again?
I was just saying, have a good day. Good evening.
Oh,
good
all
morning.
right.
And I just read your comment, Ben. Thanks for the from the glaze to the glint. I'm gonna have a T-shirt made. So
there you go. And I want to give a sincere thank you to all of you that came, and those, I know it's way past bedtime for you, Dr. Mick, and that's what I've been calling you in my head. I hope that's not inappropriate. So, and Paul, I am so glad that you were both here tonight. So, and with that, we are finished.